IVM.
Hi everybody, just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. My name is Rohan, and I am joined here today with Prateek, Waghre. I think we do technology podcasts once a week at All Things Policy, and I have the pleasure to be joined by Prateek and Sapni most days. And a lot of the stuff that we talk about on the podcast is based on Prateek's excellent newsletter, MisDisMal-Information, which of course I read every edition and I thoroughly enjoy. But this time around when the edition came out, I thought we should record a podcast on it because essentially MisDisMal-Information is a newsletter that talks about information disorder. And this time around, it talks about why we shouldn't talk about information disorder. It's a bit of a paradox that I've been wanting to understand. And that's why I have Prateek here with me. So hi Prateek, how are you doing?
Hey, Ro.
So let's begin, Prateek, by first talking about why it's pertinent to not talk about information disorder as much. And then I also want to talk about, you talk about this bit in the newsletter, which is why fake news has lost meaning. So tell me why you did this newsletter and why is fake news not the same anymore?
Yeah, and look, and that's a point I addressed in the edition itself, right? In the sense that it seems odd it's something that has done 52 editions on information disorder. There is conversation about less focus on information disorder. But some of this was sparked by this article that an essay that Samuel Woolley had written called "It's Time to Think Beyond Disinformation." Right, and this resonated with me because to some extent it is some of the points or the broad takeaway aligned with what we had said in our paper, right, where we about categorizing the harms attributed to digital communication networks. Right. So in that, what we had done is, we had identified basically that there are, very strong incentives to perform and participate, right, in quotes, in attention markets. Right? There are various affordances on those platforms for control and manipulation of information, which has resulted in, lowering of trust in various institutions, both public and private, and generally leading to negative impact on social cohesion, right? And then when we've done the cognitive biases bit of work on that part of it, we had noticed that those associated with in and out group dynamics, right, and group hostilities, things like anchoring, stereotyping, bandwagon, those had a relatively higher occurrence, as well as things like things to do with recency and availability of information. Right? So I saw some parallels there. In fact, and we had said in the paper that look, the implications of all this are that that our conversations need to go far beyond just looking at whether a message is true or false. Right. So that's why this got my attention. Right now, coming back to Samuel Woolley's piece itself. Right now, he basically says that look, it's we need to, and he's largely talking to researchers, but I'm also picking this up and applying it a little broadly, wherever it makes sense. Right? But the idea was that his call was that should expand our frames beyond just understanding things in terms of disinformation and look at broader issues, right? And I'll quote. He talks about propaganda, coordinated hate, manipulative content about electoral processes, and incitement of violence. Right? Now, these are all important issues, and they do get talked about today. But typically, there is a sense that they take a backseat to just the larger question of disinformation. Right? And the other point that he makes is that look, very often the groups that researchers are studying, right, who are using the various mechanisms, don't necessarily use out and out disinformation or false information. Right? There is an element of truth that people build on, right? And this is something that actually it just struck me that a point that is made in the book Art of Conjuring Alternate Reality, right? But also make that point, right? That there is an element of truth. So it's not completely false information that a lot of these campaigns or these efforts, right, the motivated effort that those are based on. Now coming to the point about the term having lost meaning, I thought that was interesting because again, there are parallels with what happened with the term fake news, right? Now I've generally always advocated against using the term fake news because one thing that, often not fake and not necessarily news. And this is, as you know, on something we've covered multiple times in various, the webinars for our tech and policy specialization, right? But it seems, right, that over the last couple of years that misinformation and disinformation terms have gone a similar way, right? They're essentially being used to discredit any views that you don't like or you oppose, right? Especially from political leaders, but it's a broader phenomenon as well, right? It was heavily with fake news, and then we said that for a while it was okay. The term misinformation, disinformation still had some sense of semblance in the way they were used, but I think that's that we're at a point where just using the term misinformation, disinformation doesn't say anything, because you'll often have interviews, right, from political leaders. They'll say, "Oh, this is misinformation," right, and just generally being dismissive of stuff just by using that label. Another point is there's another parallel, right? Around the same time this essay came out, Renee DiResta wrote another essay in the Atlantic where she talks about scope creep associated with these topics, right? And the point she was making, and I'll paraphrase here, but is that very often it's opinion that's being contested, or that and she gives specific examples in that essay, and we include that. But very often it's opinion, right? That's being spoken about or being bandied about, and you can't always label that as misinformation or disinformation from the perspective of whether it's true or false, or attribute motives to it, right? So that's where the scope creep of these terms come in, right? So this is not from the perspective of the term being weaponized, but just being used too broadly for it to have too much meaning.
Right. I think the scope creep point is quite interesting. It sort of also brings me to, I would say, my follow-up question, which is, see, when you talk about these things, you talk about platforms, or as you say in your paper, digital communication networks. They also spend a significant amount of time and resources to sort of deal with this. Now, tell me a little bit about the opportunity costs that these platforms sort of face when dealing with this. And then I also want to talk about the information ecosystem after. So those two things, please.
Let me actually flip that around. In sense, let me do the information ecosystem analogy first, and then I'll come to the opportunity cost, because I think there is some parallels between the information ecosystem and the points about the term misinformation, disinformation that we were just discussing, right? So the information ecosystem analogy, and where I came across it was in this book called "You Are Here" by Whitney Phillips and Ryan Milner, and it uses the analogy of environmental pollution to look at the information ecosystem, right? And I think and while most analogies are imperfect and are limited in certain ways, where I think this helps expand the frame beyond just true or false, right, or just misinformation, disinformation, is that it opens it up to the perspective of looking at just beyond the fact that, hey, is this piece of information true or false, or is this something that was done with a good intention or a bad intention, and instead it helps us focus on the effects, right, and how different actors are deeply intertwined, in the sense that you can have just to go further down the analogy, right, you can have small polluters and large polluters, right, which is whether it's just accounts with small following doing things like this, or accounts with large following doing like this, and how they tend to feed off each other. The other thing is that rot in the system can build up over time, so it's not necessarily that the effects are always visible immediately. There is a slow build up over time. Certain norms build up over time, and then we see the effect only much later, right? Unless you've been paying very close attention to it. And I think this is useful, because especially the intention part, because we hear very often, right, that, hey, I did this because I didn't think it was wrong, right, or I called out so and so person because what they said was wrong. The difference that the ecosystem analogy shifts is that when you look at effects, right, sometimes depending on who you are, right, if you are, and let's just take a very specific example of Twitter, right, let's say you are an account with I don't know 100,000 followers, right, and someone told you with 200 accounts, and you quote tweet them, right, with the basically disagreeing with what they say or calling on what they say. Yes, there is some signal that you send out that, okay, this message is wrong, but there's also the fact that given in the environment you're in, how that also can lead to a sort of algorithmic reward for that account, right? And these are tactics that people use, right, very often. So, which is why it's important to start looking at things from the perspective of effects, right? Now, again, it's not easy. It's not always easy to say what is going to have a good outcome or a bad outcome. But I think just moving one step beyond just looking at intentions to introspecting and looking at effects has certain value to it, right?
Hey, thanks. I think that was quite interesting, Prateek. Let's take a quick commercial break, and when we come back, we can talk about the opportunity cost and how platforms deal with this.
Hey everybody, it's been a great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Cyrus Says, singer and music composer Osho Jain tells Cyrus all about his debut album, SAR. Want to find out all there is about mixed martial arts? On Simplified, Chuck Narantoni and Shrike speak to Siddharth Rao, a national level kickboxer. On All Things Policy, Sapni JK and Megha Pardi join Mihir Mahajan to discuss regulatory initiatives related to the use of AI. And on Football, Shivpal, Siva Sapre and Karthik talk about the action-packed game week that it was. Man U, Barcelona and India losing their games on the same day, Mo Salah's hat-trick and a whole lot more. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Cred, Bank of Baroda, Quarter, CoinSwitch, Kuber, Flay Coffee, Intel, Kotak Mahindra Bank, and Oxfam India. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Hi, we are back. Welcome to All Things Policy, and I am here joined by Prateek Waghre. And I think it's time to talk about how platforms deal with misinformation and the opportunity cost, more importantly, that rises. So talk to me a little bit about that, Prateek.
Yeah. So the opportunity cost is an interesting thing, and I'm going back to Samuel Woolley's say, right, where again he addresses this to researchers, but I am again doing my thing when I said I'm just going to apply it a little more broadly, right? But the idea is that look, it's when researchers tend to focus specifically on that, it's taking away from other issues like hate speech, like incitement to violence, etc., that people could be researching on. It's taking time away from that. The second is that it's creating, potentially unintended consequence of, amplifying it in the sense that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because you have on the one hand, you have researchers looking at it, and you have journalists covering it who are themselves very often affected by some of the harms, right? So it sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in that sense, right? And the other unintended consequence of this is that look, if you're focusing on the wrong problem, right, if you're misdiagnosing the problem, we're likely heading towards the path of incorrect solutions or inappropriate solutions. Right? Just to take a few examples, right? Because and we've already seen some of these. Is that you're likely to get things like anti-disinformation or anti-fake news laws. Right now, from the few that are out there, we've seen that these are typically applied against dissent and against opposition candidates, just anyone that that the government may or may not like, right? Or if they don't like what they say. Or we'll have various type of proposals to come up with either commissions to regulate information disorder or some sort of independent regulators. Which again, I think details are important here, but it just gives off this very Ministry of Truth vibe, right? Because you're essentially trying to put a regulator or a government body in charge of saying what is true and what is false, right? And that can happen if you're looking at things from the lens of whether it is true or false. Some of the other intended consequences, and I'm drawing on these based on what I've seen suggested as solutions, right? Based on the reading that I've done. One is this: it can lead to this belief that we can somehow fact check our way to agreement, right? Now, this is interesting because I don't think we fully understood the effect that fact checking has. Research on things like backfire effect and how much effect correction have. I think it's still evolving. Right? There isn't a clear consensus, but some recent research is now pointing to the fact that we need. I shouldn't say facts. It's pointing in the direction that corrections need to be highly specialized or focused, right? Now, I want to clarify, right? This is not a criticism of the act of fact checking or the organization that do fact checking themselves. I don't think any of them run around claiming that this is the magical solution to our problem. But it's a broader thing of how we approach it, in the sense that what do we collectively need to do beyond just making fact checks available to people, because motivated reasoning plays a part, confirmation bias plays a part in the decisions that people make, right? So we're unlikely to fact check our way into agreement, right, on a lot of issues.
Right. I also feel like once you've sort of as a platform done a bunch of research on misinformation and so on, then other problems also sort of get categorized under that. And I think you talked about that. But I think the analogy here I would use is that once you have a hammer, everything sort of becomes a nail. And the other thing I would like to sort of talk about is that we've talked a lot about Woolley's paper, but I know that you mentioned Ben Thompson's work on this as well. So can you tell me a little bit about his perspective on these things?
Yeah, so he's not specifically written about this, but this was the point he made in one of his recent editions, talking about the Facebook fight, and I think this is a controversial point, and it needs to be studied further. But as a hypothesis, it's interesting, and I think certainly worth investigating. Right? That disclaimer aside, his point is that look, or the question that he raises is that look, is the focus on misinformation making things worse from a polarization perspective, right? And so when I was thinking about this, so, as a thought, it's something that I haven't been able to fully wrap my head around at this point. But I was thinking of this at two levels, right? The first is in the context of something that's easily fact checked, where you have something that you can easily verify as true or false. What happens when one group constantly sees their messages being labeled as false, right? And they sort of then believe that whether it's labels, flags, suspension, etc., that they're being targeted in some way or the other, right? And this is very much happening, right, with the right wing in America. Right? A lot of conversations are about how they're being unfairly censored by a platform, right? And the question is, hey, is this leading to an increase in polarization, right? The second level of this is trickier because it involves situations where it's not necessarily easy to fact check something, right? And this goes back to, hey, whether it's just opinion or whether it's something where we just don't have enough information to conclusively say whether something is true or false, or it's something in the future, right? So if an event has not happened, right, you can't necessarily fact check or pronounce it whether it's true or false. Yes, you can say that it's likely or unlikely, right? Which, to be fair, a lot of the organizations doing this do that, but that's not necessarily then how it gets carried into regular public discourse, right? And then how that plays a role, right? Because now once we fact check something that's fuzzy, right, and how that feeds into the level one bit that I was talking about, right, into the belief that certain groups have that they are being unfairly targeted, and how that plays into polarization. I think that's certainly worth investigating. I don't believe we've studied this enough. Now, I know there have been some studies from the perspective of, hey, these things are not necessarily targeted more at one side of the political spectrum versus the other. But from the perspective of what belief it creates within those groups, right? I don't know if we've studied that, and I think that's certainly interesting and worth study.
Right. Thanks for that. I think this has been educational for me, reading your newsletter and also interacting with you on the podcast. I don't think there are any solutions to this, any easy solutions at all. And I think we've said this multiple times before on this podcast. So let's instead just end by saying that these are extremely interesting times. And as someone who writes a letter on dis and malinformation, it's a pleasure to have you looking at them and seeing how this debate evolves. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
आजकल लोग पॉजिटिव शब्द से ही डरते हैं, पर यकीन मानो कोविड के आगे भी दुनिया है जहां पॉजिटिव और सही चीजें जरूरी है। और हमारे देश में जहां-जहां ऐसे काम होते हैं, स्माइल इंडिया मौजूद है। यही समाचार तो ढूंढ कर लाती हूं मैं, शिफा माइत्रा, आपके लिए हर गुरुवार। स्माइल इंडिया आप सुन सकते हो हिंदी और अंग्रेजी में IVM के ऐप पे, वेबसाइट पे या जहां कहीं से भी आप पॉडकास्ट सुनते हो।
Remember the days when our granny used to narrate once upon a time stories? Let's bring back the good old days of moral stories with Storytime Tamil. Hi, I am Ravishankar Balachandran, host of Storytime Tamil podcast. I would like you to entertain and educate your children with stories from Storytime Tamil. Tune in to the new episode sharp at 7 p.m. every day on IVM website, IVM podcast app, YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcast from.